She missed her life-changing interview to change a stranger's flat tire. The line sat in Clare Jensen's mouth the way a pebble does in a shoe, sharp, impossible to ignore. Outside, rain had a sound like fingers drumming on a metal lid, and the city smelled of wet concrete and diesel. Clare wrapped her thrift store navy suit tighter around her as if it could still be made right. The fabric was thin in the shoulders, but it was the only suit she had that read graduate instead of maid's daughter. Around her neck, warmed by her palm, the St. Christophora medal was a dull oval of worn brass. Some nights she would trace the tiny, flattened saint until the brass shivered into a line of words only she could read. 20 minutes. Her whole future was 20 minutes away. The 6:15 a.m. bus always started its route with a hiss and a sigh, as if it were clearing its throat for a story it did not entirely remember. Clare had taken it since she was 11, when Susan Jensen had put the familiar address of Riverbend in Clare's school forms and in the margin of every letter that mattered. Riverbend was the part of the city that had not been renewed. Its blocks kept the memory of better weather in the way their pavements wore the letters of other people's shoes into them. The elevator in Clare's building slammed its door with the same indifference it reserved for ambition. The building smelled of boiled cabbage and lemon polish. The polish was from Susan's small ritual. She would polish the brass door handle at 5:30 each morning, and the handle would glow for 10 minutes like a quiet promise before anyone touched it. Clare dressed with a care that was almost liturgical. The suit came folded in a paper bag with the thrift store sticker still on the sleeve. Gableton Goods, pre-owned treasures. The seams had been stitched by hands that wanted to last. She had pressed the collar with the iron Susan stowed under the sink, and she had fastened the metal so that it lay against the top button, a private armor. She had spent the night rehearsing answers to questions she imagined the Harrison Legacy Scholarship interview might ask. What shapes leadership? And who do you owe your first lesson of duty to? She had practiced saying Elias Thorne without the catch in her throat. Elias Thorne was a name that came with the smell of pipe tobacco and old medals in the family. He was a sergeant who had once taken a young Clare's hand and said, "Duty is what you do when no one applauds." It was not hero worship so much as family grammar, a way of speaking that lined up thought with action. On the way to Founders Hall, Clare's knots of nerves were a held breath. Beneath her small agitation, there was a steady clockwork of practicalities. The scholarship covered tuition, yes, but it also covered room, board, and the little things, books, a second-hand laptop, travel costs, things that Susan counted on as if they were rationed sugar.
If Clare secured the Harrison, the Jensen ledger would tilt from desperate to plausible. It was the kind of tilt that made windows brighter. At 8:02, the sky broke open. Rain came in sheets, wet enough to erase the chalk marks on the pavement, and cold enough to hollow the face of anyone who forgot an umbrella. Clare had tucked a hand into the inner pocket where she had hidden a folded note from Susan, handwriting small and precise. "Be steady. Breathe. We are steady." She had 20 minutes. The bus would take 20 minutes if it did not get stuck in traffic. She could run the last 2 blocks. She had done it before, the way you run when the sound in your head is louder than the world. She almost missed him. He was half a silhouette under a black umbrella, leaning against the curb with a singed cardboard box at his feet. A flat tire lay like an accusation beside his car. One of those older models with a kindly profile and a dent in the fender, as if it had been softened by time. He had the kind of hands that had once made things, thick at the fingers, careful around small screws. He was not young. His coat was the color of a room at dusk, the collar stiff with rain. Clare could have kept walking. She knew how those decisions worked. She had been taught, in small ways, to evaluate cost and consequence from the time she washed porcelain in the kitchen and considered the brusque economy of dish soap. But the man bent then, fingers fumbling with a lug nut. A child's bicycle could not have been more painfully exposed than that man's discomfort. The decision was not drawn out. There are moments in life that are short enough to be mistaken for accidents. This was one of them. Claire's knees found the mud with the obliging familiarity of someone who had scrubbed 1,000 pans. The suit absorbed the rain and took on the smell of wet wool and engine oil. Her hands, already damp from the rain, found the jack and the wrench. The metal warmed under her chin. "You mustn't," the man began, and he had a voice like someone who had learned manners at a heavy table. "It's no trouble." "Let me," Claire said. Her words were practical as gears. "You'll only be later by 20 minutes, the man finished for her. He smiled in a way that was almost a mirror to Claire's thought. "Which matters," he said softly. "If one has an appointment we cannot miss." She did not look up at him because there was a gear in her head that needed turning. She worked with a kind of patience that had been taught at the scrub board and at the bedside. Steady pressure. Listen for the small changes. Do not let the job know you are tired. Rain ran down the back of her neck and pooled at her sleeve. A taxi blared in the distance. A bus hissed and swallowed itself around the corner. Claire's shoulder blades remembered the scrubbing board.
When she straightened, her palms were black with grease. The hem of her jacket clung to the mud on the curb, and the metal was a smear against the wet fabric. She had an apologetic smile that belonged to a girl who had learned to carry her dignity in practice, not presentation. "I can get you to the university," said a voice, somewhere between a thought and an offer. The man had opened his umbrella. Water blinked off the spokes in a way that made a small constellation under the street lamp. He reached into the glove compartment and produced a handkerchief that smelled faintly like lemon and old paper. He offered her his arm as if he were guiding someone through a museum and not a storm. "I shouldn't." "Then you'll make me late," he said, and now there was humor in the edges of his voice. "Allow me to be at fault." She let him. She climbed into the car with a crispness to her that was part habit, part design. She did not want to appear indebted in any more ways than the universe had arranged. She sat on the edge of the seat, trapdoored with damp, and the heater threw a warm, floral smell into the space that felt like someone had lit a different kind of morning. He did not introduce himself. He looked older than the city papers and younger than an old photograph. He drove with a careful honesty, as if every move of the wheel had been measured against some inner code. He kept his hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. When he changed gears, they moved like generous hands reshaping clay. They arrived at Founders Hall with the car's tires sighing on the wet pavement. The building was granite and light. Lights in the windows were like patient eyes. People in umbrellas held small bright orbits of conversation. Claire's shoes left smudged footprints on the marble steps. She could feel the weight of the suit, heavy now with the evidence of the morning, as if the fabric had been witnessing and had decided to keep the record. "I am likely unpresentable," she said. "You look like the sort of woman who could get past most guards." His voice had a gravel of amusement. "Go in, make them see the person in the suit." Claire hesitated at the threshold. She thought of Susan at the sink, polishing brass, and of that ledger with its thin columns where silver numbers meant hot water and no eviction notice. She thought of Elias Thorne's stiff hand, and the lesson that duty, if lived, did not always bloom into reward. Then she climbed the steps. Founders Hall was a place designed to make entrance feel like confession. The walls were high, the portraits were intentional, and the carpet had the soft indulgence of money that had been careful with itself for a very long time. A woman behind a glass desk watched Claire approach like a sentinel. She had hair in a controlled chignon and a face learned to say no before it learned to say hello. Her nameplate read Evelyn Price. Claire had rehearsed her words a dozen ways. She had prepared an opening sentence that was low and respectful. She had practiced not crying in the office bathroom where she had tried on her suit 3 days earlier. The meeting would be simple, she thought. Introduce herself, explain what Harrison meant to her family, answer the questions about leadership with examples of small duties and steady hands. She had a copy of her application folded in her bag, the essay tucked within it like a small treasure. The legacy of duty, she'd called it, an argument that duty could be a neatly stacked pile if you learned to arrange your life in service. Evelyn's eyes moved over her in quick, categorical sweeps. She saw the wetness first, the politeness second, and the grease on Clare's hands third. "You are late," she said, without inflection, in a voice that had no mercy for excuses, only statements. "It was a flat," Clare began. "A flat," Evelyn repeated, "is not a reason the Harrison office accepts, Miss Jensen." She kept her pen moving as if the sound itself could make the world fold into the paperwork she preferred. "We scheduled an hour per candidate. Missed interviews are a breach of protocol." Clare's voice was smaller than she had meant. "I was helping someone. We cannot take on every variable," Evelyn said. "We must treat the process fairly." There was a human calculus in Evelyn's insistence, and Clare felt it close around her like a glove too tight for the hand that needed to work. Humiliation, when it arrived in a room like Founders Hall, had the decor of protocol and the patience of an archivist. It catalogued you in a single, narrow file. Clare found herself apologizing for things she had not done, as if the admission would soften a hinge. "I understand," she said. The words sounded like a confession. The lobby seemed suddenly very large, and the rain on the windows like a chorus, reminding her that water had erased other people's chalk before. Outside, the car that had brought her was gone. The street had been washed into a mirror. Clare walked back down the marble steps with hands that wanted to scrub at the grease with the public force of embarrassment. She had missed the interview. She had made choices. Both statements were true and did not conspire to make anything softer. She had not yet learned the arithmetic of a final notice. On the bus toward Riverbend, the humidity of the morning made the carriage feel like a slowed animal. People read newspapers with the attention of people who were practiced in looking at columns of text that did not include their names. Clare sat pressed to the plastic and thought of Susan waiting with a bowl of something hot and the radio that played soft numbers. She imagined when she would tell Susan how to begin. There is a grammar to not being the bearer of bad news, and Clare had worked out a polite, flat sentence. It did not go as planned. When the bus jarred and the driver cursed at a pothole, Clare's shoulders curled inward as if to conceal itself from a public that smelled faintly of other people's soaps. A woman behind her coughed. A child kicked a seat and apologized in a voice that suggested the apology was a habit honed to ward off trouble. Clare fingered the metal. The brass was a little cool now, like a small coin from summer. Riverbend's streets had a thrifted dignity. Closed shutters, a bakery with bread that smelled of late sunshine, a paint job the color of oatmeal, things that did the best they could under circumstance. Clare's building had an old brass bell that stuck halfway if one rang it too fast. She used the key that had been under the flower pot because the landlord had promised he would forget a promise and had not yet remembered to keep it. She climbed the stairs, the same tread worn just so by hundreds of feet that had the business of living. There was a letter under the door. Letters in Riverbend were small things that traveled heavy with consequence. This one had a window cut into the envelope like a throat. "Final notice," the paper said in a font that was not interested in kindness. The amount due was printed in black, a number that felt like a weight on the chest. Clare's breath got small and bite-sized. There were pages, 2, 3, that explained the due process of eviction and the timeline and the means of payment. It was official, impersonal, and absolute. She sank to the stoop outside the building because some news wanted the ground close to hold it. The rain churned into puddles at her shoes, and the mansard shadow of the street lamp drew a small island around her. All the small, useful things she'd counted on were sliding into a single thin line of calculus. The Harrison would have covered part of this. Now it would not. The ledger in her head that kept track of hot water and school books and trips to the dentist began, for the first time in a while, to sputter. When Claire opened the door, the apartment smelled of lemon polish and wiry coffee. Susan was at the stove, stirring a pot of something that had ivy leaves of steam rising from it. Her hands were marked by memory, half a lifetime of the culinary and the domestic, calluses on her thumb and a faint bruise at the base of one nail. She looked up when Claire walked in with wet hair and a rain-stained suit and the trace of something like defeat in her step. "You look like you've been in a storm," Susan said, and she moved like a woman arranging the furniture of a small disaster. She took off Claire's coat without fuss and hung it on the back of a chair as if it were a coat that could be given a place and manner. Her expression was not shocked, it was not theatrical. It was the simple math of a woman who had always had to balance until the scale stopped wanting to fall. Claire held up the medal, as if it were proof that she had not mislaid the part of herself that blessed small acts.
"It was a flat," she said. "I helped him. I was late." Susan's lips made a little line that did not need explanation. She wiped her hands on a tea towel and sat opposite Claire at the small table that was the family's map of concessions. She opened the flap of the notice and read it slowly, as if tasting the paper might make it tell a different story. "Final notice," she said, and the syllable had weight, but not astonishment. Susan was a woman who had turned consternation into routine. She might have made the final notice a declaration of doom in another life. Here it was a fact to be arranged. "Is it everything?" Claire asked. "We have 10 days," Susan said. "They give you notices like this so you know the world keeps its own calendar." She folded the paper and tapped the rim with her forefinger. The thought lines around her eyes relaxed into something like planning. "We can manage the utility this month if I ask Mrs. Davies for an extra shift. There's a thing at the bakery for Saturday mornings. You could—" Claire interrupted her, not because she wanted to contest, but because there was a shame that needed naming. "If I had made it," she said. "If I'd been there on time, if you'd been on time and you had been late for some other thing next week," Susan said, and her voice took on that patient firmness that had carried the family. "Claire, listen. You held a wheel. You did a thing that matters. Not everything is a ticket that gets validated by someone else's clock. It cost us," Claire said. "It cost us—" She looked down at the medal. "I ruined the suit." Susan reached across and took her hand. The grease left a gray half-moon on the tea towel where her fingers met Claire's. She did not flinch. She did not make the grease a symbol. She made it a stain to be washed. "You helped the person in front of you," she said. It wasn't a sermon. It was a fact and, with the way Susan said it, a deliberate reframing. "We will find a way." There was something proud in Susan's voice that Claire hadn't expected to hear in quiet. It wasn't the kind of pride that dismissed fear. It was a steadier heat. "Elias Thorne used to say," Susan began, and the name landed like a coin on the table between them. Claire smiled at the mention, a small half-remembered thing. "He said, duty was for when no one was looking," she supplied. "He didn't mean duty as a ledger," Susan said. "He meant it as a habit, and habits build a person. One day we'll be counting the different currency we earn by living a certain way." Claire wanted to believe it. She believed it the way she believed the chair would hold her when she sat. She wanted the ledger of good choices to accumulate into something that could be cashed. The medal lay like a small, stubborn will against the table, its brass dulled by the grief of mourning. The rain stitched itself into the window panes and blurred the world into something that felt like a question mark. Later that afternoon, after an unsuccessful search for a replacement interview slot and a phone call to the Harrison office that yielded nothing better than the polite and immovable firmness of a voicemail, Claire walked past the corner where the man had been stranded. The tire repair shop had closed for the day. A small boy in the doorway squinted at Claire as if measuring whether the world had been unkind or just distracted. She wondered if the man would remember her. He had been careful with his thanks. His hands had left a faint oil on the inside of her wrist, as if he had given her a secret in exchange for practical help. His face had been lined, as if carved by economies of expression, someone who had owed smiles and had been careful about whom to spend them on. At home they ate quietly. Susan spooned stew into bowls, the aroma the kind that settled like a possession. They made plans that were precise and small. A second shift for Susan, a weekend at the bakery, an application for a part-time job listed on a poster that the landlord had allowed to hang in the lobby. Clare brushed the grease from her sleeves, tried not to pick at the softened seam of the suit, and listened to Susan make phone calls that sounded more like a series of small raids on the city's economy than pleas. "Mrs. Davies can do an opening shift," Susan said. "It won't be forever, but it will hold us." At night, Clare lay awake with the medal against the sheet like a small moon. She thought of the man's voice and of the warmth behind it. Make them see the person in the suit. She felt a strain in her ribs that was equal parts exhaustion and the pressure of possibility, what felt like a pregnant pause before something decisive. The city's rain had stopped. The street outside had dried in the ink of headlights. A letter slid through the mailbox at 2 a.m. and landed like a soft, tremulous thing she almost did not notice until it slipped against the heel of her foot. She rolled over, found the light switch, and ruined the sleep of the other hours with the recognition that sometimes paper had the same brute finality as winter. The final notice sat on the table like a verdict. Clare had believed that she had saved something moral that morning. The ledger did not care. It had the efficiency of systems that had been built by people who never had to ask themselves whether mercy paid a utility bill. Fear arrived as a practical thing. What would they do if the water were cut? What would Susan do without the kitchen? How many small economies could one family fracture before the world said they must leave? She told Susan everything she had done, why she had been late. The story of the tire was not dramatic in the way of rescue, no cinematic healing or swoop of gratitude, only the simple fact that she had chosen to stop. Susan listened and did not scold.
She folded the paper in small, exact turns, and then hitched Clare's sleeve and smoothed the wrinkle near her elbow as if she were stitching cloth and pride together. "We will call Mrs. Davies," Susan said. "We'll ask if she can spare anything until—" She stopped, because hope can be cheapened by overstatements. There were real constraints to be respected. "And you'll keep looking for work," she finished. "There are internships that pay a stipend. There's a weekend class at the community center about financial aid. We will do the things we can." Clare wanted to be heroic about the choice. Instead, she was humble and tired. Humiliation is not always a theatrical collapse. Often it is the small internal counting of what you took away from someone and how that subtraction aligns with a ledger of consequence. She had a kind of moral clarity that tasted like steel. She had no illusions. She had acted, and it had cost more than she had predicted. They went to bed that night with the lamp low and the understanding that resources were thin. The medal lay on the bedside table like a witness. Clare closed her eyes and tried to call back the man's face, his cautious smile, the careful way he had said her name, Miss Jensen, as if it belonged to a file he had not yet opened. The city made a slow, indifferent promise outside with the shift of other people's curtains. The next morning did not bring mercy, only the practicality of life continuing. Papers had to be filled, numbers added, and other survival things that are the work of people who move between schedules and small miracles of budgeting. Clare had 2 interviews set up, one for a weekend job babysitting for a family who lived in a building that smelled like citrus, another for an after-school program that paid in both money and references. She lined up her days like dominoes that needed careful placement. She did not expect a knock at the door. When it came, it was neither late nor early, but measured. Someone had a right to be careful at a door in Riverbend, because doors here sometimes opened onto strangers who deliver bad news or better advertisements. Claire opened and saw a man in a dark overcoat with rain still beating on the shoulders. He looked like the figure from the street this time, but slightly more measured, as if his outline had been smoothed by distance into something familiar. There was a man with the kind of clothes that fit across continents of money, but who still chose to stand in the rain and be practical about attire. "Miss Jensen," he said. His voice had that same precise amusement. "My thanks again for this morning." Claire braced for an awkward exchange of politeness and a small recompense, perhaps a token payment that would have the vagueness of good intentions. Politely declining was an art she had practiced. "You're welcome," she said, because the manners that had been taught were good manners.
"I read your essay," he said, "and the world narrowed in that particular way to the size of a single sentence." He reached into his coat and produced a small envelope with the Harrison seal, the lettering embossed and patient. The rain on the steps somehow made the scene feel less like a stage and more like a hinge between what she had assumed and what might yet happen. Claire was not prepared for the small little concussion of feeling, curiosity, surprise, a raw hope that felt like a tremor. He extended the envelope like something fragile and certain at once. "I hope you'll read it," he said. "You are right. There is a thing called duty, but there are also calendars we must obey." She took the envelope, the Harrison seal pressing against her thumb, cool, deliberate. The letter was concise, an invitation to speak, a request for clarification, and an appointment that suggested neither balm nor condemnation. It was neither a scholarship nor a denial. It was an opening. Claire felt the grease at her wrist as if it were an index of the morning's labor and a key to the next steps. She wanted to ask a dozen questions. She wanted to know whether there was a patron who believed in the currency of small acts, or whether this was the polite work of a man with curiosity. She wanted to know how many times the world had to be nudged before it shifted. "Come," he said, "I'll take you to a place where they make decisions. I have time." She thought of Evelyn's face and the stare that had seemed unkind. She thought of the final notice and the way Susan had folded the paper like a lifeline. This time, the offer did not come with a schedule of obligations. It came with the simplicity of a hand held open. "Why?" Claire asked. It was the question that lives at the base of many stories that have yet to be told. The man smiled in a way that made his eyes crease. "Because I would like to understand how duty looks on the hands of the young," he said. "And because it seems prudent to see that what our foundation supports is matched by the people who inhabit our city. We say we honor legacy. I want to see what legacy looks like today." She let him lead. She stepped into the car and settled as if into a book she had been meaning to read. The suit still clung to the morning. The medal warmed, and the rain finally eased from witness to memory. On the passenger seat, the envelope rested like a small, possible thing. They did not speak much on the drive. The city's face passed like a series of pages. Shops with neon yawns, a bridge that dressed itself in institutional lights, a waste bin that had been turned inside out by some careless evening. The man drove with a quiet deliberation, as if his hands were in conversation with a steering wheel that knew many lives. At Founders Hall, there were more steps to climb and a receptionist who had the coolness of practiced form. Claire smoothed the lapel of her wet jacket with fingers that did not feel like her own. The man waited without an introduction, like a shadow that had been allowed to accompany her into daylight. When they reached the desk, the receptionist asked a small question and checked a small box on a clipboard that had never seen a stain. "You are early," the receptionist read from a list, then smiled the corporate smile that meant she had done her small duty well.
Everybody in the room performed their roles, and the building, which had once made Clare feel like a beginner in a universe of protocols, now hummed with the solemnity of possibilities. Clare offered a nod that meant "thank you" and "I owe you nothing, and yet I accept this chance." The man in the coat did not follow her into the interview room. He lingered in the doorway like an unannounced encore, then disappeared into the corridor with a lightness that made Clare think of the way some problems solve themselves when someone else notices them. Inside, the interview room had a window that looked out upon a small garden where the rain had pooled in the hollows. Clare sat opposite a panel of 3 people, 2 of whom had the firmness of people who had written policy papers. She answered questions with the measure of someone who had learned to make small truths out of harder experiences. She spoke of Elias Thorne in that way young people speak of ancestors, not heroically, but as a grammar of behavior that shaped everyday choices. Evelyn Price's voice entered the room like a reservation. She had not been kind the first time they met, and the memory made Clare's jaw work like a hinge. Evelyn kept her notes in order, penciling and erasing like a woman who corrected the history of conversations as she heard them. At one point, the panel paused and looked at Clare as if they wanted to choose something they did not yet understand. They asked for examples of duty in practice, and Clare mentioned her mother's schedule, the way she kept the house systematically clean to make money stretch, the way she had arranged the week's meals to protect heating costs. She spoke without grandeur. She spoke in the small specifics that made her life legible. When she left the room, the rain had become a memory, and the light in the lobby had taken on the gravel tone of late afternoon. She felt as if she had given a small, honest account of herself. On the steps, she saw the man in the coat watching her. He had a small smile like a book's margin. He lifted a hand in a tiny salute. "Thank you," she said, because the habits of politeness were the only currency she always carried. He inclined his head in a way that suggested he kept his thanks among fewer people and more meaning. "You did well," he said. "We shall see." It was a phrase that tugged at hope like a bell. You could not hang your life on it, but it was a rope you could hold. Clare walked away feeling a thin sort of optimism, as if a match had briefly struck in a room of damp wood. She had done the work.
She had acted with the small mercy that meant something to her. She had been seen, and there was a small chance that seeing would change the way other people tallied goodwill. And yet destiny does not admit of clean arithmetic. Founders Hall closed its doors, and the city prepared for night. Clare's suit would dry, or it would require mending. The grease stain would not simply vanish. In the ledger of bills, the final notice still sat like an unstomped seed. She had given time and received a possible future in return. The balance sheet of living in Riverbend asked for patience and small cunning. That evening, as she was mending a seam and answering a call about a babysitting job the weekend after next, there was another knock. This one did not carry the easy rhythm of the previous morning. It had the deliberation of footsteps that knew addresses intimately. Clare opened the door, and for a moment did not speak, because the man who stood there belonged to the kind of life that paid other people's wages from a distance. He held himself with the gentle precision of someone who had made decisions that shaped other people's days. "Miss Jensen," he said again, "I have read your essay." The Harrison envelope was gone this time. He did not offer the brassiness of some great gift. He offered questions, and questions are often the first honest currency of men who want to change things. "Would you come for tea? I would like to hear more about Elias Thorne." She looked at Susan in the kitchen, the simple domestic scene lit under the lamp, and then at the man who had the neat kindness of his kind. Susan's eyes met hers, and in them was an instruction that had little drama. Be grateful, be measured, do not assume favors. Clare nodded. She did not yet know whether this knock would become a turning point or a small unexpected kindness.
She only had the sense that some doors once opened did not always close in the same way. She invited him in. He took off his coat with the care of a man who understood how all rooms had small economies. Jacket hung, umbrella leaned, shoes removed. He had the quiet air of someone who had moved from rooms that decided national things to rooms that decided private acts. They sat at the small table. Susan poured tea, and the domestic clatter made the man's composed expression settle into something like ease. He listened as Clare spoke, and when she mentioned Elias Thorne, he pricked up in a way that made Clare's pulse skip. "You speak of him as if he taught more than battle," the man said. "Duty as habit rather than parade. That is rare." Clare shrugged. "He was stern," she said, "gentle in his stubbornness." The man nodded. "What you did that morning," he said, "was simple. But what concerns me is whether institutions like the Harrison live up to what they claim to believe. I suppose a man of my resources has an opinion on the subject." His eyes softened with something like amusement. "But I would rather form that opinion by seeing the people we claim to serve." Clare sipped her tea and felt the heat like a small, steady pulse. She did not expect fireworks. She had not planned on drama. She had planned on making lists, taking interviews, working nights at the bakery. Yet there was in this stranger's attention a pressure that made time feel like a coiled spring. At the end of the visit, he rose with a promise of action couched in the careful phrasing of someone who had learned to make promises stick. "I will review your application myself," he said. "If your essay is as honest as you seem, it deserves to be read with its context." "That's generous," Clare said, very aware that she was standing on a small slope of hope. "Generosity is only a tool, unless it's followed by proper work," he replied. "I shall ask Thomas to look into the file." When he left, the medal on the table looked less like an artifact and more like a ledger that kept count of small choices. Clare watched him go and felt, despite herself, the fragile tilt of possibility. She turned the medal between her fingertips and heard inside her head the echo of a voice that said, "You helped the person in front of you." But the city has ways of making even small hopes into tests. That night, the final notice seemed louder. The phone calls that Susan made were met with polite refusals or the kind of curt offers that were more paperwork than help. Clare slept poorly. The mattress remembered her worry. The next morning brought a rain that was not cleansing, but deliberate, an insistence that the world was still a system of cause and effect. At 9:30, the phone at Susan's kitchen table began to ring. Clare answered it the way you answer a bell at dawn, cautious but ready. The voice on the line was practical and thin, a reminder that the landlord had a process, that the timeline in the notice had not shifted, and that payments were due. The numbers were blunt. The voice at the other end had nothing but arithmetic. "Is there anything else?" the caller asked, voice smooth as ledger paper. "No," Clare said. "No, there is not." She hung up and then stared at the ceiling as if it contained a map with an exit she had not yet noticed. The morning stretched into small searches. A call to the bakery that answered with a "We'll keep your name on file." A text requesting an interview time that bounced back. A text requesting an interview time that bounced back as if the number itself had decided to be private. The small practical defeats layered like damp clothes on the shoulders. Every attempt to move forward met with some modest resistance. Clare kept her phone face down on the table so she would not have to watch hope blink and die in little notifications. Days moved with the slow stubbornness of people who must rearrange their lives around bills. Susan took the extra shifts at Mrs. Cromer, Davies's house, and at the bakery. Clare took afternoons shelving books in the university library, and evenings helping at the after-school program. They traded sleep for practicality, and wore the tired look of people who measure victory in kept promises rather than parade banners. The final notice stayed folded in a drawer like a dry leaf. Its threat was constant, but it was also, in a strange way, something to plan against. They would move, fix, and fold their lives around the dates if they had to. That was the work of people who had no illusions, action over sentiment. Meanwhile, in rooms that smelled of paper and quiet authority, the Harrison file had moved in its own slow orbit. Robert Graham read Clare's essay 3 times. First with the curiosity of a man who found a phrase that tugged at an old habit. Then with the attention of someone cross-checking a claim. And then with the private attention he reserved for things he might later defend. The essay was not grandiose. It did not call for monuments or public plaques. It argued for duty as habit, 100 small details stacked until they shaped a life. It mentioned Elias Thorne in a paragraph that slipped the sergeant's name in like a footnote to the world he described. An ancestor, a grammar of behavior. Robert paused at that line. Something in the phrasing matched a phrase he had heard once in his own childhood. Duty is what you do when no one applauds. He had been raised believing that legacy needed a steward as much as an archive. He put the paper down and sent a note to Thomas. Thomas was efficient. He ran quick searches, he rang the landline listed on a marginal spreadsheet, and he checked the application against the Foundation's records. An applicant named Clare Jensen from Riverbend. A single essay that had been flagged for its plain, steady voice. Thomas pulled up a parcel of other data, emails, the receptionist's entry logs, the schedule of interviews, and noticed the mark where an applicant had been turned away for lateness. He narrowed the time window, found Clare's arrival, and saw Evelyn Price's note, punctuality, breached. He made a mental check next to founder's attention, and left it blinking with the kind of quiet urgency that accompanied decisions made differently than policy alone would suggest. "She's the one who fixed a tire," Robert said when Thomas came to him. He did not phrase it as a question. He had, in fact, already remembered the hands at the table that morning, the dark crescent of grease at the wrist where someone had simply done a thing. He had a way of noticing small marks on people and treating them as evidence of the life lived. "Bring me what you have. I want a fuller picture. References, family history. If this matches the voice, I want to meet her again." Thomas left and returned with a tidy packet within the hour. Application, school records, teacher recommendations, and a slim list of references. He had also, with the discreet thoroughness the office required, looked into the name Elias Thorne. Military records and a local memorial entry in Riverbend lined up with the family lore. A photograph, slightly yellowed and folded at the edges, showed a young sergeant with the same mouth Clare's essays had described, a mouth that seemed to have made its peace with responsibility. Robert touched the photograph once, as if to verify its texture, and then set it by his cup. "Arrange it," he said. "I want to understand what our scholarship looks like when it reaches people who speak like this." Arranging it meant bending a governance process that had been built to be sturdy. A meeting of the selection committee, signatures, a review that required more than a fond remark. Robert called Evelyn. He did not call to scold or command. He called to ask questions, and as he asked, he set into motion the kind of private insistence that happens when one person uses the resources they have to align practice with declared principle. Evelyn took the call with the kind of firmness that made small policies feel essential. "We have a protocol," she said. "If someone is late, we cannot keep opening windows for every excuse." "I am not asking for a carte blanche," Robert replied. His voice was measured, not to flatter but to persuade. "Read the essay again. I will sit on this month's selection meeting. If it merits further review, we will take it. If not, the process will stand. But I want to see the person behind that handwriting." Evelyn paused, the pen in her hand making a small circle on the paper. Her face had an honest muscle that moved when people sought exceptions. She had built her professional life on a different kind of duty, stewardship of fairness through rules. To her, rules were a way to make compassion impartial.
But the founder was the founder, and practicalities had a way of yielding when a principal architect asked for reconsideration. "Very well," she said. "Bring it to the committee. Document the exception rationale. We'll meet Friday." That's how a door that had seemed closed found a hinge. Not because policy was abandoned, but because someone with both curiosity and the authority to ask for an honest look applied himself to the work. The Foundation's committee convened. Papers were read aloud, not as ritual, but to make sure the language did its work. When the essay was read, the room quieted in the way rooms do when language carries the weight of ordinary truth. People asked the practical questions: grades, financial need, likelihood of completion, and then asked what might not fit on a spreadsheet: the quality of character in small acts. The vote was not unanimous. It was a complicated human thing that required real argument. Evelyn insisted on documentation and precedent. Other committee members argued the mission needed to be more than a line in a brochure.
In the end, the founder's voice carried a particular authority. He insisted the foundation be true to its declared mission to honor legacy, not just to keep the machinery of selection moving neat. He suggested a conditional award, a full scholarship contingent on Clare's acceptance of mentorship, and a plan for the outstanding financial gaps their award could not cover immediately. The committee agreed, and the paperwork moved. But the scholarship was only the first practical hinge. Robert had watched Clare in the small domestic scene at the kitchen table and understood two things clearly. First, that families are ecosystems. Help one person and you must tend the rest. And second, that dignity often arrives dressed as practical opportunity. Susan, whom he had seen move around her small apartment with the momentum of competence, had a presence that belonged to managerial tasks: scheduling, procurement, and oversight, things the estate needed. He asked Thomas to invite Mrs. Davies, whose name had come up as someone who could recommend Susan, for a discreet conversation. Mrs. Davies arrived with the warm bluntness of someone who had managed staff and kitchens for a long time. She spoke plainly of Susan: reliable, exacting, able to command a team without shrillness, and to make a kitchen that served well under pressure. Robert listened. He imagined the estate as a place that needed practical, humane administration, the sort that honors labor by making it visible at the center rather than tucked away at the edges. Would she be interested in a role as household manager? Robert asked Thomas after Mrs. Davies' recommendation. Thomas looked at the list of duties and considered logistics. It would offer stability and pay, he said. It would also give her a voice in how things are run. Then offer it properly, Robert said, not a charity, but a position with dignity. A week later, an envelope arrived at Riverbend with a different sort of gravity. A formal letter from the Harrison Foundation advising Clare that the committee had voted to award her a full Harrison scholarship, and that Robert Graham would like to meet with her to discuss mentorship opportunities. A separate note, careful in its tone, not patronizing, offered Susan the role of household manager at the Graham estate, with a starting salary that would move the Jensen ledger into better numbers, and with housing assistance for a transition period if she wished. When Clare read the scholarship letter aloud at the small kitchen table, the paper trembled in her hands as if it were an animal startled to find itself safe. Susan's face blurred with relief. There was no sudden windfall. The scholarship would come with conditions and mentorship commitments, and Susan's new job would require a transition and new responsibilities.
But the practical effect was immediate. The final notice would not claim them that week. The ledger could be balanced. Their small plan would no longer have to hide in the dark. They cried, not from melodrama, but from the particular release that comes when a hard economy is finally given a practical answer. Susan folded the paper and, with a steadiness that had been her trademark, started to make lists. Who to call, what to keep, what to stash in a box for the estate. Clare sat for a long moment with the medal curling in her fist like proof of the choice she had made that morning. She thought of the grease on her palms, and how those dirty fingers had led here, and she felt something like astonishment at the cause and effect of living honestly. When Robert visited Riverbend to speak formally with Clare and Susan, no longer in the thin civility of a morning knock, but with the quiet exceptionality of an employer meeting he had arranged, he brought with him practical gestures. A modest envelope contained funds to cover the immediate arrears. A second envelope held a voucher for a suit tailored properly this time, not to make her fit a world she had not earned, but to stop the world from reading her as something other than she was. He discussed the scholarship's mentorship portion in plain terms. 2 formal meetings a month to discuss coursework and career goals, and introductions to people who could provide internships. The mentorship was not a gilded parade, but a steady stewardship. "You helped the person in front of you," Robert said in the kitchen as Susan reached for the tea towel, catching the line like he had handed them a small, private truth. "I want to make sure we honor that by giving you resources to keep doing it." Clare listened and felt a modest, honest joy that was afraid of being too certain. "Why me?" she asked at one point, because the question that most people who are offered favors first ask is whether they have stepped into mere luck or were recognized for something they themselves had cultivated. Robert looked at her with the patience he reserved for the difficult answers. "Because the organization I started has words on a page, and sometimes words require someone to make them real. Because your essay argued that duty is habit, and the habit we honor should be supported, not only applauded. Because your family has paid a price that we, who live differently, owe a practical accounting for." Evelyn handled her part with professional reserve. She arranged the formalities and reminded Clare of the conditional requirements. The committee would set milestones, there would be reviews, and the scholarship would include expectations for maintaining the award. She did not soften the rules, she merely made them transparent. When Clare thanked her, Evelyn only nodded. There was no dramatic warming, only the quiet satisfaction of someone who had seen the rules serve the purpose they were meant for.
"Do not waste the opportunity," Evelyn told Clare bluntly but not cruelly. "Our goal is not simply to rescue, but to enable you to finish and to help others in your stead." That charge, and the way it reframed obligation as ongoing, sat with Clare like a new kind of compass. It was not a bribe to conform, it was a demand that she continue to be herself with the resources now aligned behind her. Susan's new role required a careful hand. The Graham estate was not a caricature of wealth. It was a place where decisions about staff, procurement, and hospitality had scale. Susan walked the halls with the intensity of someone who had earned the right to reorganize small economies. She developed rosters, negotiated supply lines, and set standards of care that honored the staff rather than talked over them. Her respect changed the feel of the house. Where there had once been a polite distance, there was now an efficient dignity that made people's work legible and acknowledged. Mrs. Davies, who had made the outgoing recommendation, visited once and nodded as if watching justice arrange itself in practical ways. "You take care of them," she told Susan, and it was both advice and an acknowledgement of the kind of labor that often goes unnoticed. Susan in the role was not a charity case. She was a professional stepping into a new, better-paid job with authority. The family's kitchen began to breathe easier with the extra income. Little things that had been previously impossible, a consistently warm oven, a repaired washer, found space in the budget. Clare left for Gableton University's opening term with a suitcase and a heart that felt both unspooled and taut with possibilities. The scholarship covered a modest room in the university housing and tuition. Robert's mentorship covered the gap between the scholarship and the immediate household needs for a year. He asked nothing of Clare that smacked of gratitude performance. His stipulations were practical and bounded. attend classes, meet bi-weekly, and think about how to put the degree to work in ways that might help others. At university, Clare learned the curriculum of economics with the same tenacity she had used to learn the informal calculus of a household budget. She liked the way models and real life argued with each other. She liked the way the professors pushed her to consider not only theory but distribution. She had been a person who knew the friction of real scarcity. The classroom gave her words to describe it. Robert's mentorship sessions were not lectures, but conversations. He pressed her with questions about what kind of policy might help families like hers, where scholarship models failed, and what institutions like his foundation could do differently. He insisted on practicalities. Internships mattered as much as ideals. The path from learning to earning needed runways. He introduced her to a small network of people who had been grantees and now worked in policy, not to show off, but to connect resources. Clare arrived at those meetings with notebooks and the humility of someone aware of both advantage and obligation. The mentorship was also quietly reciprocal. For Robert, the meetings were an exercise in listening to what young people felt they needed, rather than imposing programs that fit a headquarters assumption. Clare's voice, practical and direct, reshaped several of his initiatives. He began to demand that the foundation report not merely cover numbers of scholarships awarded, but follow outcomes: job placement, mentorship satisfaction, and household stability. He learned, with Clare's help, that legacy was not an artifact but work, a set of ongoing decisions aimed at preserving dignity. At home, Susan managed the transition to the estate with a competence that made the staff trust her. She earned the respect of colleagues while maintaining tenderness with Clare. Their Sunday afternoons, once a steady, cramped sequence of laundry and lists, grew to include calls from Clare about course choices and small celebrations of milestones: a first satisfactory grade, a pantry item restocked, a new blouse spot with the stipend that allowed a small pleasure without guilt. The household's rhythm altered gently but surely. Months later, the Jensen apartment looked different in subtle ways. The final notice had been paid. The drawer that once held it now held receipts and an envelope of papers showing a schedule for Mrs. Graham's onboarding. They kept a small box of things to take to the estate should Susan wish it: an old wooden spoon Mrs. Davies had given them, a photograph of Elias Thorne folded carefully into a wallet. Life had not become perfect. There were still economizing choices to be made: a dryer that occasionally balked, and an old heater that developed a rattling cough in January. But the ledger had leeway now that allowed the family to breathe. Clare's suit, mended and retailored, hung in the closet like an armor repaired by someone who knew how to stitch dignity into fabric. She did not wear it for show. She wore it because it allowed the world to read the first line of her carefully written life. The metal, however, never left her. It shifted from being private armor to a witness kept in a pocket to be touched before a difficult call or a speech in class. She would feel the worn brass and remember the morning with the flat tire, the mud, the grease, the choice. The metal had transformed from talisman to story marker. At the Graham estate, Robert did what he said he would. The foundation selection criteria adapted, slowly, to better measure daily courage and practical outcomes. The Harrison Legacy Scholarship continued to fund students, but now included a small household stipend to help families with immediate needs, an adjustment Robert insisted on after listening to Clare's description of what a final notice did to a household. Evelyn objected initially on procedural grounds, but her objections were practical, not moral. She worked with Thomas to create transparent metrics. The stipend had rules and auditing, making it no longer charity but structured support. When the first annual report came through, her name was signed under a new section that tracked household stability, an addition she would later insist had improved the foundation's mission fidelity. Claire's presence in the campus library was steady and visible in a quiet way. She developed study groups, took a leadership role in a student association focused on community economics, and wrote articles for the campus paper describing how policy could be humane without being hand-waving. She was good at connecting the small practicalities, transportation, childcare, part-time shifts, to larger policy questions. Students and teachers alike noticed a particular quality in her writing. It did not moralize, it translated. On a late autumn evening, Robert invited Claire to the Foundation's small meeting room. No fanfare, just a table and 2 cups of coffee. "How is the model looking from your side?" he asked genuinely. She spoke of internships that still failed to pay living wages, of scholarships that overlooked the household's immediate needs, of students who left because of small disasters. He took notes, not as a performative gesture, but as a record that would be acted upon. They talked about a pilot program he would fund, a small grants program to help scholars with emergency bills, rent, medical, or a broken washing machine. It would not solve systemic poverty, but it might prevent the attrition of bright students whose lives hinged on the small accidents of fortune. Claire insisted the process be quick and user-friendly, no forms that required a social security of shame. Robert agreed. In winter, Susan walked the halls of the Graham estate in a coat that had been repurchased with her new salary. She ran meetings with suppliers and staff, negotiated menus, and discovered delight in working with a head chef who trusted her and a procurement officer who appreciated her clarity. On Saturdays, she would come home to Riverbend not because she had to, but because family is its own gravity. She would bring with her small gifts, a bag of better flour, an extra tin of coffee, and the apartment would smell of roast more often than it had before. Sometimes she and Claire would sit in the kitchen, elbows on the table, trading stories about the people they met and the ways life rearranged itself with small kindnesses. Mrs. Davies continued to be their ally from the margins, checking in and offering practical wisdom.
"You do the job," she told Susan one afternoon as they licked spoons and tasted a new sauce. "You don't let the job make you small. That's the work." Susan laughed, a bright sound in a kitchen that had trained itself for preservation. The life that unfolded was evidence that good work reshapes expectation in ways that are quietly transformative. Time, which had been their adversary, became a medium for new rhythms. Claire graduated her first semester with respectable marks and with a small internship lined up in a think tank focused on community development, an internship that had evolved from a meeting Robert arranged with a friend. She called Susan that night from a phone booth on campus that smelled faintly of old coins and long conversations. "I got it," she said, and her voice was bright with the practical, shaky joy of someone who had navigated a small sea. At the think tank, her practical instincts, learned in kitchens and at library stacks, were assets. She saw how policies that made sense on paper could be unworkable in real homes. Her voice found traction among policy analysts precisely because she could name obstacles with a candor that made solutions less abstract. Her mentors admired how she connected dots others assumed irrelevant. On a spring afternoon, after a mentoring session, Claire walked to the edge of the estate gardens and found Robert staring at a line of young saplings planted there last autumn. He had a way of looking at young things that suggested he took responsibility for their growth. "You helped someone the morning you missed your interview," he said softly, watching the saplings. "And what you did after, that's what we need more of. People who see the person in front of them and make choices on that basis." She touched the metal in her pocket and felt the worn brass like a small compass. "I didn't expect," she began. "None of us expect our lives to be tidy," Robert said. "We expect them to be true, if we're lucky." "Are you?" Claire asked, blunt because she had learned to ask blunt questions. "Lucky?" Robert's smile was a brief concession to humility. "No," he said, "deliberate. I try to make things line up with what I say matters."
Clare thought of Elias Thorne and the sergeant's phrase about duty when no one applauded. She thought of Susan at the sink, of Mrs. Davies's blunt counsel, of Evelyn's steady insistence on rules meant to be fair. She thought of the tire and of mud and grease and the way a single choice had the quiet power to reroute a life. She also understood with a clearer appetite that her own choices would now be shaped not only by gratitude but by responsibility. If the foundation had invested in her, she wanted to make that investment pay back to others. Years later, the Jensen household had settled into a new ordinary. Susan's salary allowed them to replace the broken heater with one that did not complain when winter came. The little things, a sturdy toaster, a real vacuum, made the daily work less of a wear. Clare finished her degree and took a job that combined research with program implementation. She never forgot the early work, the library shelves, the after-school programs, the late nights of studying by borrowed light. She began her own small practice of mentoring young people from Riverbend, taking time to read their essays and to show them how to make their applications legible without losing their truth. The medal remained in her pocket for big decisions and in her jewelry box for tiny, private ceremonies. It was no longer only an amulet. It was a story piece she traced when she needed to remember what weighed most. That small acts counted, that choices reshaped lives, and that dignity could be returned with practical help rather than spectacle. The final scene is simple. On a Sunday, Clare comes home for a visit. The apartment smells of roast and lemon polish. Susan moves through the kitchen with a competence that remains luminous. They sit at their small table with a second cup of tea and laugh at a story about a student who had once locked herself out of a classroom because she had been nervous. The laughter is quiet and the kind that repairs. Outside on the windowsill, the medal glints, worn, familiar and useless as a currency but priceless as a story. Clare lifts it in her hand and lets it rest against her palm. The brass is warm from the sun. It fits like the memory of a day when she chose a person over a clock and, by that choice, altered many clocks to come. A man who was once a stranger and later a mentor walks up the street past their door, unremarked upon by most, and pauses to watch a child struggling with a bicycle. He nods to himself and keeps moving. The world they live in remains complicated and imperfect, but it is also full of people who, when faced with a need, stop. The story of the maid's daughter who helped a mysterious old man closes not with a single act of fortune, but with the gentle, durable consequence of choices that honor duty and dignity. If this story moved you, share one small act of kindness you witnessed or received below. If you'd like more stories like this, like and subscribe for more true-to-life tales of ordinary courage and quiet grace.